And it goes a little something like.
Did Islam influence how Harar entered the modern world? For hundreds of years, Harar was an Islamic state walled from its Christian and pagan neighbors. The city's early development was heavily influenced by Islam. In Sunni Islam, the best way of life is to follow the actions of its prophet Muhammad, a man who lived in 7th century Arabia. This custom is difficult in a modern society with technology and science that developed, and is developing hundreds of years after this man's death. Muslims in a modern world must decide if it is acceptable or forbidden to engage with technologies that are emerging. These technologies alter how they live in ways their prophet never imagined. Muslims in positions of power can influence public perceptions and adoption of technology. This can result in either social and economic progress or stagnation. So, we're going to travel back in time and find out if Islam influenced Harar's adoption of 5 key technologies that dramatically modernized societies. The printing press is a machine that prints text and images onto paper and other materials. It enabled for quick production of written materials such as books, pamphlets, and newspapers. The printing press was invented in 1436 by the German Johannes Gutenberg. In 1485, the Ottoman Caliph Sultan Bayezid II declared the printing press is haram, forbidden. This declaration was with the support of all Muslim scholars. In 1515, Sultan Selim I of the Ottoman Empire decreed anyone found in possession of a printing press within any Ottoman territory would be executed. Starting from 1520, only Christians and Jews were allowed to own and use the printing press within the Ottoman Empire. The materials they printed could only be used by their communities and in their languages. It wasn't until 1729, 300 years later, when the printing press was allowed for Muslims to use. But there were 3 conditions for the Muslims. 1. Nothing could be printed in Arabic. 2. Nothing related to Islam could be printed. This includes Quran, Hadith, Tafsir, and Islamic history. That meant only books on secular sciences and history were allowed. And 3. The government would have complete control over a list of approved books and regulate every aspect of those books. When Napoleon conquered Egypt in 1798, he also brought the printing press to the country. This marked the beginning of unrestricted use of the printing press by Muslims. Despite this, it wasn't until 1870 when the first Islamic printing press was established for printing religious texts. This was the Bulaq printing press. So why did the Ottoman Empire first ban and then heavily regulate the use of the printing press for Muslims only? Why was the printing of Islamic texts not allowed until over 400 years after the printing press was invented? Wouldn't it be in the Ottoman Empire's best interest to increase access to Islamic texts so that all Muslims could learn more about Islam and become better Muslims? There are a few reasons why the Ottoman Empire rejected the printing press. 1. They did not want to use technology built by the Christians to print the sacred holy Islamic texts or the superior Arabic language. And 2. They did not want Muslims to have unregulated access to mass-produced Islamic-related texts or print their own. This was because it might introduce the average citizen to criticisms of the government and new ideas that challenged the empire's interpretation of Islam. Muslims gaining literacy or critical thinking skills meant they might start to question Islam or even leave it after reading Islamic texts or texts critical of Islam. The Ottoman Empire saw what was happening in Europe because of the printing press and did not want the same to happen to their empire. In Europe, the quicker production of texts led to rapid spread of information and ideas to large groups of people. The printing press played a critical role in the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance. The invention led to higher literacy rates, the mass production of literature, religious criticism, and the scientific revolution. The printing press enabled groups who didn't have a voice like women and political and religious reformists to disseminate their ideas. This led to these marginalized groups gaining support, power, and legitimacy. The Ottoman Empire feared unregulated use of the printing press by Muslims would undermine their authority and legitimacy because they would no longer be the only source of information. The mass, unregulated dissemination of knowledge could weaken the empire's control over the population because they could no longer control what they knew. And of course, with knowledge comes power. Also, in Islam, Muslims are required to obey the ruler of their nation. If the Muslims became literate and started to come to their own conclusions about religion, they may decide to follow a different interpretation of Islam that challenges the government or even leave the religion entirely. The Islamic government would view this as a threat to their authority. The Ottoman Empire thus wanted to maintain their monopoly on power, so they kept the average citizen ignorant, loyal, intellectually dependent, and obedient. As expected, the Harari Emirate followed the example of the Ottoman Empire and never adopted the printing press. Harar ruled as an autonomous Islamic state until 1875, when the Egyptian Ottomans invaded Harar and occupied the land. In the Ethiopian Empire, the printing press was introduced in 1863. Harar received its first printing press in 1901. This was after it was incorporated into the Ethiopian Empire in 1887. From the beginning of Harar's foundation in the 16th century, the residents became skilled in calligraphy and bookbinding, creating thousands of religious and legal texts over centuries. This can be partially attributed to the lack of the printing press. Because there was no alternative method to producing books, over centuries the Harari people developed their skills and handmade thousands of religious and legal texts between the 16th and 19th centuries. If the Ottoman Empire had allowed the printing press in 1485, what would have happened to Islam and the empire? What would have happened to Harar's book manufacturing industry? The sewing machine. In 1909, the American corporation Singer opened the first sewing machine store in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. A few years later, Singer agencies opened in other cities in Ethiopia, including Harar. The public reception was positive, and there was rapid demand for sewing machines. In 1905 to 1906, there were 20 sewing machines in Harar. Within the next 2 to 3 years, the number skyrocketed to 250. The sewing machines helped improve Harar's economy, as the people would use raw imported materials from Europe to produce garments for export to the highlands of Ethiopia. The sewing machines also gave way to the development of Harari fashion. For example, the first atlas, which is a traditional Harari dress for women, was sewn using an imported sewing machine by a Yemeni tailor who moved to Harar in 1870. Without the sewing machine, there would also be no gay ganafi. This traditional Harari women's trouser uses a drawstring around the waist, has a plain upper half and a decorated lower half that is narrow towards the calves and ankles. A little-known fact is that these pants were developed in this peculiar way by the emir during the Egyptian occupation in 1875. This was an attempt to prevent Harari girls from being raped by the Egyptian soldiers. The thought behind the design is that anyone trying to attack a girl would be deterred by two things. 1. How long it takes to take off the pants, and 2. The sight of the intentionally ugly upper half. The railway. In 1877, Emperor Menelik's Swiss advisor was the first to suggest building a railway from Addis Ababa to the coast. This idea was rejected by the Ethiopian government because they thought it would be dangerous and had too many factors to consider. In 1889, Emperor Menelik suggested building a railway from Harar to the coast, which was later agreed to be the port city of Djibouti. This was just 2 years after Harar became incorporated into the Ethiopian Empire. To build a railway directly to Harar would require the railway tracks to be laid up the mountainous terrain of the city. This would be expensive and difficult, so it was agreed for the railway tracks to pass through the valley called Dire Dawa instead. The tracks would end at a new village that would be developed. This new village was to be named Addis Harar, or New Harar. However, the name was not popular, so it was abandoned in favor of the existing local name, Dire Dawa. There was a later proposal for this railway to extend to Harar via a branch line, but this proposal was rejected by the Menelik's Ethiopian government. Construction of the railway began in 1897 in Djibouti, and was completed in Dire Dawa in 1901. The decision to not extend the railway into Harar was influenced by many factors. For one, there was major opposition against the construction of the railway to Harar by the residents of Harar themselves. Local community leaders and businessmen would gather at events and hold protests against the building of the railway to Harar. Businessmen saw this new foreign technology as something that would divert business away from their road traffic source of caravans, thus destroying their livelihood. Local leaders in Harar protested against the railway because they didn't want to bring white men into the city. This position is quite understandable considering Harar's history and culture at the time. Merchants traveled using caravans to conduct their business for centuries. A faster method of conducting business was a clear threat to their income and ability to provide for themselves or their families. Instead of deciding to adapt to the new technology and be open to learning, some chose to protest in an effort to maintain the current system. Also, the indigenous Harari people were still recovering from their loss at the Battle of Chelenco in 1887. Thousands of Harari male soldiers died, so the demographics of the native Harari population would have been a female majority. Since the Egyptian occupation in 1875, the influx of non-Muslim men into Harar's once closed city posed a threat to Harari men who saw them as predators. To make it easier for the white, non-Muslim men of the French-colonized city of Djibouti to travel to Harar further threatened Harari men's control over the future of their community and their ability to preserve the Islamic value of female honor. To the Harari people who were opposed to the railway, the desire to preserve the community's way of life and values were far more important than the potential economic and social benefits this new technology could bring. Emperor Menelik and his advisors also had second thoughts about the railway connecting to Harar. This was because they thought it would leave the city vulnerable to being taken over by the French. The Ethiopian Empire did not want to lose control of the city of Harar, so they ultimately rejected the proposal of the branch line that would connect Harar to the Dire Dawa Djibouti Railway. The railway helped establish the city of Dire Dawa and allowed it to flourish into a business center. While some Harari protested against the railway connecting to Harar, many ended up leaving the city to seek the economic opportunities that became available in Dire Dawa. The telephone and telegraph. In 1894, Emperor Menelik introduced telecommunication services to Ethiopia by beginning the construction of the telephone line from Harar to Addis Ababa. It was completed in 1898 or 1899. In 1891, Emperor Menelik requested the French government set up a telegraph line from Addis Ababa to Harar. However, the request was not fulfilled. A telegraph line that connected Harar with the coast was eventually established in 1903. Both the telephone and telegraph systems greatly reduced the time for messages to be communicated over long distances. They improved the political, economic, and even religious activities within Ethiopia. For example, it is recorded that Muslims used the new telephone system to call a religious authority figure for clarification in an Islamic religious dispute. The camera. In 1883, Arthur Rimbaud took the first photograph in Harar. The photograph is of a Harari artisan sitting on the floor surrounded by pottery and baskets. Between 1885 and 1887, Austrian ethnographer Dr. Philip Policzki also took photos in Harar. Harari soldiers were photographed and were reportedly happy when they saw their photos. However, the Harari ulema, or Muslim scholars, at first thought the camera was against the Quran. Their interpretation is understandable considering there are hadith that states creating images of humans or other animals is haram. Even today, there is debate among some Muslims on whether taking photos is truly haram or not. Policzka persuaded the scholars at length and informed them that other respected Muslim leaders in Istanbul, Cairo, and Mecca all had their photographs taken. Eventually, the Muslim scholars provided their approval, and the emir had his picture taken in 1885. But even then, the emir was hesitant to display this picture to the public. He asked for it to not be shown in Harar. As we've seen, the influence of Islam on modernization and technology adoption in Harar varied depending on the technology. To preserve the sacredness of Islamic texts and the Ottomans' control of power and religious information, the Islamic Authority limited the use of the printing press for 400 years across the Muslim world. This influenced the adoption of the printing press in places like Harar, even though it was an autonomous Islamic state and not under the authority of the Ottoman Empire. The railway connection to Harar was rejected because of fear. The Ethiopian emperor feared a takeover by the French, while the Harari people feared the threats to their way of life and Islamic values the railway could bring. While photography was reluctantly accepted by the emir of Harar, debate among Muslims regarding its permissibility continues to this very day. In contrast, Technologies like the sewing machine and the telephone were readily adopted and even helped Harari Muslims maintain their religious values and practices. The sewing machine helped create the Gay-Ganafi, which they used to try to preserve the Islamic value of female honor. The telephone was used by Muslims to quickly contact religious scholars for advice. Therefore, the Harari people approached technology and modernization with caution if there was a risk it went against Islam, their way of life, or their values. However, if the technology did not pose any threat, they embraced the technology and even used it to support their religious and secular goals.